Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second International Churchill Society lecture at RUSI this year. The first was on March 13th by Sir David Cannadine about Winston Churchill, then and now, his continuing relevance in the 21st century. We are also having a lecture by Professor David Reynolds at the end of this month, May 30, on Churchill and the War. And then on June 18th, we are having our June lecture by Professor Margaret Macmillan. But tonight we have Professor Ali Ansari, and all of you here are in for a special treat. Ali is, I want to say perhaps, but that's a little too modest. I think he is the leading expert in the UK on Iran. He is a professor at St. Andrew's College up in Scotland. He is also the founder of the Institute for Iranian Studies. He is a visiting fellow at Chatham House, and he has advised the UK and US government on Iran and Iranian affairs for many years. That was actually how we first met. And when I invited him, when I was Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, to please come in and explain what was happening to us in Iran, because it was very difficult for us since we had not had any representation in Iran since 1979. But tonight we are here to listen to Ali give his talk on Iran, what has been happening there recently, and it could not be more timely. We all know the events in the Middle East are unfolding every day, and Iran is a crucial actor, whether that region will see more peace and prosperity or perhaps more unrest and volatility in the coming years. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ali Ansari.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I'm sort of slightly daunted by the list of speakers that you have, Mitchell, coming. I think I'm sort of a slight bit of a musical interlude, perhaps, between Margaret Macmillan and David Cannadine and others. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. I only got to know about the International Churchill Society, much to my shame and embarrassment, I have to say, last October, when Mitchell very kindly invited me to the gala dinner and the conference that was being held, obviously, in Edinburgh last year. And as we know, the conference will be held this year in London for the 150th anniversary. And a very good thing it is, too, I have to say. I thought it was marvelous. This is the second conference, I have to say, that Mitchell has invited me to. And I wanted to sort of highlight one conference that when we, in amongst all the very learned and sage advice I was meant to be giving to various government departments at one stage or another, he invited me in 2007 to go to this conference at William and Mary College on the 400th anniversary of the foundation of Jamestown. And they were celebrating there, the Americans, obviously, the birth of democracy, so on and so forth, and had wanted a Middle East component. To which I have to say, I thought felt rather fraudulent. I was saying to Jill earlier, as we were talking about this, that I sort of said, well, there's not really a huge amount of democracy I can talk about. I mean, it's not going terribly well and all that. He said, no, come. I mean, we need to think aspirational, very American, actually, aspirational. Let's look forward and let's be very positive about it. So needless to say, it didn't take much persuasion. Off I went, and I was, I have to say, and I have said this to him before, and I will say it to him again, it was a salutary reminder never to turn down an opportunity, even if you think it's slightly off your turf, because clearly it was off my turf in many ways, but it was one of the most enlightening and illuminating conferences I think I'd ever been to. And it was a real revelation in part, because the conference hosted, I think, some of the real luminaries of American historical study who were working on the American War of Independence or American Revolution, depending on which way you like to look at it. Obviously, we quite looking forward to the return. Eventually, King Charles is always very merciful. And then in between, interspersed with all these learned comments, there was a wonderful interlude of school children who came to give the school history version of American history. And I thought this was a marvelous sort of contrast between one of the themes that I will be talking about today, which is that sort of that contrast between what we might call academic history, learned, full of insight, and the more popular history, if you will, that sort of tended to paint the world in primary colors and provided a rather glorious vision of where we were all going. Because obviously in the popular version, everyone was happy and everyone was together and they all marched forward in the pursuit of American democracy and democracy for the world. Whereas I always remember the faces of these academics who were sitting there rather sort of awkwardly as these school children came in. I mean, they enjoyed it, but yes, it was a lovely contrast. And I think this in some ways, as I said, highlights one of the themes that I'm going to talk about today, which is that use of basically that contrast between history and myth, and particularly history and myth as we understand it vis-a-vis Iran. Now, of course, the other aspect that I do need to talk about, because it's important, obviously, is Churchill. And I mean, obviously, I had to pick out, there's some other more interesting pictures as well, but this is obviously one that's very familiar to all of you. But of course, this idea of how we understand Iran, and I had settled on this wonderful quote, obviously, that Churchill made in a speech in 1939, where he's talking about the Soviet Union. You'll see he says Russia, but the Soviet Union, I cannot forecast you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And then, of course, the final bit of the statement, which is quite interesting, of course, which most people don't use, but perhaps there is a key. That key is the Russian national interest. So there, you know, one of the things that I find interesting about Churchill in terms of his contribution and what we could look at in terms of our analysis of world events. And here was a man, as a colleague of mine reminded me, had fought on 4 continents, which is quite something, I have to say, but had a real acute understanding of global geopolitics. Here is, I think, a pivotal person to help us understand the relationship between history and policy. And I'm going to be very clear here, by the way, that unashamedly, to say that I am going to be arguing very, very clearly here for the notion of a sort of an applied history, or history in the service of policy, as opposed to some of the other disciplines that I'm sorry to say I think have tended to sort of litter their way around our policy analysis, and I think have made life a good deal more difficult. Churchill, on the other hand, was someone, as we know, who was immersed in history. And he used that experience. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about him, of course, is he's not a university person. He's self-taught. But goodness, was he self-taught? And did he produce a huge amount of material which helped shape the way in which he thought about the world? And for me, history, in a very simple sense, and I'll go into this in a little bit more depth when I look at the 3 different factors that I want to talk about in relation to Iran, of course, in terms of what Churchill can tell us. History offers us 2 key ways of thinking, if I can put it that way. One is that it teaches us about process and development. So it doesn't tell us what things are, it tells us how things became and where things might go. And I think for a policy perspective, that's enormously important. Unfortunately, in some disciplines, and let's say international relations, I know we're in RUSI, but you know how, it's international relations and some other more subjects that settle on the science and political science, let's say, are far too descriptive in my sense and not analytical enough. But the other thing that history tells us, and the other thing that a training as a historian can tell us, is really the use of evidence and the understanding of evidence and how we use evidence to construct those narratives. In the historical field, obviously, we're always dealing with a paucity of evidence. There's always an incomplete terrain that we're looking at. We don't have the full picture. But we have to somehow put things together to provide a narrative, an argument, and a way in which we're looking at. And I think particularly when you're looking at authoritarian systems, by the way, and authoritarian governments, this becomes particularly relevant. We can't go around expecting to have perfect levels of data, and the obsession with data is something that bothers me a bit, but the perfect levels of data when we're dealing particularly with authoritarian systems of government. So how do we understand and appreciate Iran? We have to recognize that the sort of evidence we're going to be dealing with is going to be problematic, and we have to know how to engage with it. A colleague many, many years ago who was criticized by some of his other Middle Eastern colleagues, and I'm not going to be particular about this, but you can guess where this colleague was from, because he wasn't able to travel in the Middle East, was criticized very heavily for saying, well, how can you possibly know because you haven't seen it and you haven't been there? And his rather pithy answer to this was, well, have you ever been to the Middle Ages? Now, I think that's, you know, one can be a little bit flippant about it, but I think it does actually make a point. That the other thing that history gives us is this notion that, you know, we have to in a sense, have powerful imaginations in that sense to be able to construct those narratives. And I think Churchill, in that respect, offered all those. I mean, people did say he was a bit of a romantic, obviously, in some of the things that he thought. But I'm going to say that what he was really expert at was realpolitik. And the realpolitik I want to really take from is and I will reference this in that sense just to say is the wonderful book that John Bew wrote recently on the history of realpolitik, and that notion of what does realpolitik involve? It involves really the how a liberal idea or a liberal government can operate in an illiberal world. And again, I think Churchill has a number of things that he can tell us about that. Now, in terms of Churchill's own experience with Iran, it's a tad more limited. It's not direct, if you will, but I think his influence in an indirect way was pretty profound. And his impact in Iran is also quite interesting. The image of Churchill, as you'll find out, is much more positive than you imagine. Of course, Churchill Street that used to grace the Tehran is no longer Churchill Street. That was unlikely to last the Islamic Revolution in 1979. However, it is interesting to see what popular views about him and what he stands for. And again, these are things I will try and draw out in the talk. You'll see there I've said Churchill in Persia because Churchill, one of the things that Churchill did do, of course, was he insisted that we shouldn't be calling the country Iran. We should stick with Persia in the English language because, and I think he had a point here, by the way, he said the trouble is if we talk about Iran, everyone will confuse it with Iraq. And this will be difficult. Let's all stick to Persia while we can maintain it. And, you know, I have to say, he did have a point. So there are three times when Churchill has quite an important impact on Iran. The first and most important one, of course, was the decision to turn the Royal Navy from coal to oil powered and to take out that golden share in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So that had an enormous impact, really, on Britain's relations with Iran, in turning Iran from basically a buffer state for the protection of British India into a strategic asset in its own right. So he did have a key role in that. In 1921, and I look there gazingly at Brad, actually, but in 1921, he had another quite pivotal role in basically dissuading Curzon and others from getting too involved in Iran and saying it's time we got out of all these places because it's a bit of a hassle, particularly after the Great War. So he actually was fairly critical of Curzon there, who wanted to have a much more hands-on effect. And I have to say, I do probably controversially in this sense, given my own background, but I probably do lean a little bit more towards Curzon than I do with Churchill at this stage, which is interesting. The third time is obviously in 1943, and we know he celebrated his 69th birthday in Iran, and this is a picture of him wearing his wonderful hat, which he got as a gift while he was in Tehran for the Tehran conference, and that was obviously the only time he'd actually visited. And the final time, which a lot of dissident Iranians will be very, very livid about, of course, is the role played, obviously, for the coup in 1953. But I will remind you that Churchill at the time in 1953 was really incapacitated, and the person running the government at the time was Salisbury. Secondly, actually, of course, all the origins of whatever coup plans and others that emerged had obviously been devised as contingency plans much earlier than Churchill. So Churchill is much more incidental to that than people think. But of course, for those who are opposed or view Churchill as the epitome of all that is wrong about Britain's relations with Iran, will see that as the point of the negative point. But for my part, I think that it's 1913, 1914, which is probably his most significant contribution and what impact he does. But more to the point about what Churchill can tell us as a, sorry, that picture is really dull, but I couldn't find anything to sort of say about his literary oeuvre, basically. But what I wanted to describe really is these are the 3 points that I'm really going to be highlighting here about what we need to do in order to better understand Iran. And the 3 things which I think Churchill can tell us. One is the value of history, and I shall be talking about that at some length. Second, moral clarity. And I'm going to distinguish moral clarity from clarity, by the way, and you'll see as I go on, but I think Churchill affords that he gives that moral clarity that we probably need more than ever now, it has to be said. And then thirdly, this realpolitik, the notion of realpolitik. So I'm going to look at in this presentation, what time did we start? Good, okay. So that's fine. Well, I'm still on track. What I'm going to look at is basically, in essence, the focus will be on Iran, obviously itself and its history and where we think we're going and what we're doing. But then I want to end a little bit with also how policy, I think, what we can learn from Churchill about the way policy works and how towards Iran in particular and what advantages we have. So those are the three themes that I really want you to keep you focused on: history, moral clarity, realpolitik. So a riddle, a mystery, and an enigma. And in some ways, it's encapsulated excellently by this photo. This is a visit by President Putin in his first round as President Putin back in 2007, where he's visiting Iran. The president there is President Ahmadinejad, the firebrand, who basically turned Iran's the direction of travel, shall you say, of the Islamic Republic of Iran on its head, and moved the Islamic Republic away from what we might call the republican elements of its constitution towards the Islamic authoritarian elements of its strategy. But the way he tried to do it, of course, was to relentlessly plunder Iranian history in order to justify the things he was doing. And one of the things that was very puzzling, of course, was the way in which he got extremely enamored with ancient Iran. And as you'll see, there's this frieze. Now, Ahmadinejad, believe it or not, had wanted to invite President Putin to Persepolis. He wanted to take him down to Persepolis, where he was going to show him the glories of ancient Iran. And frankly, the Slavs could do a lot better than to pay homage to the ancient Persians one way or another. You'll be interested to know there was a newspaper at the time who did say, as Putin was going abroad, this is a papier-mâché, I have to say, mock-up of Persepolis in Tehran, because thankfully, even some of the clerics at the time said it would be obscene for Ahmadinejad to take Putin down to Persepolis. It would seem to be something in emulation of the Shah, which they didn't want to do. But for some reason, they allowed him to do this, which in many ways is worse. But nonetheless, it allowed a number of newspapers in Iran to talk about the way in which the emperor of the Slavs, as he was called, was coming to pay homage to the emperor of the Persians, which was quite a striking thing to say. I think Putin obviously didn't read those Persian papers at the time. But it is an interesting case, because we look at the Islamic Republic of Iran and we say, you know, to what extent is it an Islamic state? To what extent does it pursue religious policies? Well, it does. But it also relentlessly plunders the ancient history of Iran to try and build a legitimacy beyond its traditional base, and to try and reach out to those in the diaspora, by the way. I mean, there's a sort of a nationalist agenda it tries to build. And after the recent missile attacks on Israel, by the way, one of the most striking things to come out, which circulated on social media, really wonderful, I have to say, if you like propaganda, but not much else, were pictures of Khamenei as Cyrus the Great. I mean, you can't get better than that. What a load of nonsense. But nevertheless, here they were, and they were actually quoting the Shah, believe it or not. So the Shah was famous in 1971 for standing in front of the tomb of Cyrus the Great and saying, "Sleep, Cyrus, for we are awake," which turned into a great joke in 1978, where everyone ran around saying, "For God's sake, wake up, because everything's going to pot." What they did was basically they used this quote and said, "Don't worry, sleep peacefully, because Ali Khamenei is here and Iran is a strong power again," which goes actually to some of the things that we were thinking about. What were the motives for what they did? What are the motives of what they did? Was this sort of imperial mentality and this desire to show themselves as the sort of essentially the godfather of the region? It was performative on one level, but they felt they had to do it because the rhetoric had led them in that direction, and they had to do something. But I have to say, what they did was, well, it wasn't certainly as effective, certainly as they were presenting. But that influence of history is enormously important. This slide I always put up because I want to reassure my British colleagues that you are still a superpower. And you are still a superpower, certainly in, and also to give Mitchell a bit of, and my American colleagues, a bit of a challenge here. This is a very recent, actually, aspect of the propaganda that comes out of Iran. And again, it's an aspect of what we term here the paranoid history that affects Iran and its understanding of the world around them. I was talking about this earlier with colleagues about how limited their understanding of the West is. But here, I mean, what I find striking about it is if you look at the 5 countries at the bottom, some of them you'd expect. I mean, I think Canada's just been put there for you, Brad, actually. But I got it. But the one that I really like is the French. I mean, it's marvelous that the French are actually down at the bottom there as well. So Germany, Ukraine, Israel, Canada, and the French. obviously being manipulated by the Americans, who are then obviously at the top of it being manipulated by the British. And in this respect, one of the things we have to understand whenever we're dealing with Iran is that Britain looms large in the Iranian and the political consciousness in Iran, particularly among the revolutionary elite, not amongst most ordinary Iranians who have outgrown this sort of slightly juvenile attitude to the world. But nonetheless, it's an enormously powerful sort of drive for many of them in the revolutionary elite. And it's part of this idea of the way in which they read and understand history. Their inheritance, clearly, there is important. The inheritance is in two forms, which I think is very important for us to understand. One is that we have to move away from this notion that the Islamic Republic emerged sort of from nothing in 1979, and this is it. Clearly, the Islamic Republic emerged from something else. And the Islamic Republic, in many ways, sought to inherit and sought to benefit from that inheritance which it acquired. The most obvious thing being a relatively well-developed and powerful state, which it has since been plundering fairly consistently over the last 45 years. But the fact is, it inherited a tradition, and a very important tradition. Now, for those running the government in Iran, that state was important. And they inherited a state without really having to do much work for it. This is one of the big differences I have with a number of academics who work on these other fields that I was telling you about. The Islamic Republic was not built from the ground up in 1979. They inherited a lot already made, and that makes you quite complacent, I have to say. You assume that the state is quite strong because you inherit a state that is relatively well developed and rich. And you don't actually take measures to understand how you have to keep reinvesting in that system in order to bring yields. Actually, what you do is you draw down on it. And that's basically what they've been doing, by the way. The other inheritance, which is very important for us to understand, of course, is the tradition of democratic development in Iran over 100 years. And that cannot be ignored either. So when you're looking at, and one of the things I described there about the Republic and the revolution, if you look at these two distinctive elements within the Iranian tradition, it's very, very interesting how divided and how wide the gulf is between the two. The revolution sees itself very much in terms of an Islamic ideology that is unfolding towards a new world order. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail vis-a-vis what we've seen with Israel recently. The Republic, on the other hand, those elements, and I just clarify it as a sort of a republic, are those elements within Iranian society who see the Islamic Revolution as simply the latest attempt by Iranians to try and achieve some sort of democratic settlement in their country following on from 1906. So it's a good long 100 years of development. Hasn't got really as far as people would like, but it does weigh heavily in a tradition. Every year on the anniversary of the Constitutional Revolution, there's normally a conference or one thing or another where students in the main are the ones that protest very, very heavily that the basic elements of the Constitution in which we require good governance, the rule of law, these things have simply not been realized in Iran. But I very firmly of the belief that this powerful inheritance, this imagination is important. It is, of course, important in the same way with the revolutionary ideals, but the revolutionary ideals, I think, are a decreasing minority in Iran. They just happen to be in charge, unfortunately, but they are a decreasing minority in Iran. And the way I see it, the more in which they the more in which they are diminished in sort of political terms, shall we say, in popular terms, the more they double down on the agenda. And they double down on the agenda for two sort of central powerful myths, in a sense, that shape the way in which they look at the world. One is that they see, the revolutionary ideology in Iran is a wonderful melange of sort of Islamic eschatology, Shia eschatology, I should say, with the return of the hidden Imam at the end of time in which true justice will be realized, with a very strong anti-capitalist narrative, much of which seems to have been adopted by certain elements in Western societies these days who have adopted this notion, of which the key to this, it has to be said, and the route to this, the route to transforming the world lies through Jerusalem. I think you have to be very clear on what the ambitions are in terms of what they're trying to do. That the obsession they have with the state of Israel in this sort of respect among the revolutionaries, not among the ordinary Iranians, actually, I have to say, which is largely ambivalent. I mean, one of the striking things that's happened over the last 6 months has been, if you have paid attention, is that the Iranian government has struggled to get crowds out in support of the Palestinians. I mean, it's been quite astonishing. The largest crowd they've been able to pull out in Iran in favor of the Palestinians has been around 3,000 people. If you compare that to what we're experiencing here, it's quite striking. Yeah. Now, why is that? It's not because Iranians don't have a sympathy for the Palestinian plight, of course, but they're not interested in the way that they might have been, because they are preoccupied with more immediate problems at home. And they also see that the triumph of basically Hamas and others would be a triumph for the Islamic Republic itself. So they are antithetical to that notion. This is quite different, obviously, to the revolutionary elite that sees it in quite different terms, that wants to see it really as a means of reordering the world. So that sort of idea is very, very, it's very pervasive in the way in which they talk. And Ahmadinejad, the gentleman we saw earlier, was famous, if I say somewhat notorious, I have to say, in going up, I believe it or not, it's quite true because I have it from the horse's mouth, you're pleased to know, to German colleagues and telling them that, don't worry, the new world order is coming and we will reorder it, and all that unfortunate wickedness that happened to you after 1945 will be reversed because it's all very unjust. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Of course, German politicians were very quick to obviously try and move away and demur from such commentary that Ahmadinejad sort of seemed to feel. But this is something that's quite pervasive among the revolutionary elite. But it's distinct, I should say, both in terms of the revolutionary elite that are running the country is distinct from those in wider society who see things quite differently. But it's interesting, and I think that distinction has to be made. Those in the revolutionary elite, of course, as the poster shows quite well, have this obsession with what is termed by colleagues of mine and others as paranoid history. That is really not a historical understanding of the way in which the global politics works at all, but really one that fits in with their ideological preconceptions. I mean, in many ways, what goes on in Iran in terms of its history and its politics is I have described it elsewhere as quite Soviet, actually. And it's interesting to see, I was very struck that when you look at some of the stuff coming out of some Russian politicians these days, there's a lot of overlap between what might be coming out of Tehran, particularly comments from Medvedev and Putin as well. I mean, it's really quite millenarian, actually. Another point to think about, as I debate with people, is this rationality and ideology. As I say to people, I think we shouldn't make that distinction between are they rational or irrational. The point is you can be very rational and pragmatic in the pursuit of a revolutionary ideology. I mean, it is possible to be pretty determined in getting to a situation which in many ways appears quite illogical to us, but to them can seem fairly logical. So those are the things that I think we need to bear in mind. And of course, the distinction, as I should say, between society and the extractive state, for me, the Islamic Republic of Iran today represents very much that extractive state, that organization that takes out of society, not simply in economic terms, but in political and moral terms, and has left a gaping, yawning gap really between itself and wider society that's struggling actually to make ends meet in what we're facing at the moment, a very serious economic and ecological crisis, by the way, which underpins the political crisis. So my reading of what goes on in Iranian in the Islamic Republic of Iran is not one that would say to you that here we have a state that is strong and stable. Far from it. What we have is a state that since 1979 has been taking out of the pot and not putting back into that pot. It's not investing into it very well. And as a consequence, it's a depreciating cycle. And this is making it weaker and weaker, or more brittle and fragile as we go on. But the consequence of that in some ways is that it will become a little bit more reckless in pursuit of some of the things that it's trying to do. And this is, I think, if you look at what's been going on most recently, even the recent, quote, elections in Iran, of which, as we know, are not really elections, is the dominance of a new, younger, as someone called them in Iran today, the neo-principalists. The principalists were hardliners. Now we have neo-principalists who are arguing that actually the reason why we haven't achieved all the things we're meant to achieve is because we haven't been pure enough. So we need to double down even further. Good luck to that, to be honest, because I think if they do continue down that route, they're simply going to make the instability of the regime even greater. And I think in part this explains some of the ideas. I mean, we were talking about what happened over the last 6 weeks and how we can explain it. And let me try and give you my own understanding. And I'm going to say this as a sort of a tentative understanding, because I don't think any of us really know what's going on in Khamenei's head. I did love his spin on it, I have to say, which was one of the most spectacularly good bits of spin that I've ever seen a leader make, which was it's not hitting the target that matters, it's the taking part, which I have to say was quite a striking comment and one that I enjoyed very much. And he said this to his IRGC commanders, who were all sort of sitting there very proud of their achievement, although, as people pointed out, we weren't quite sure what the achievement might be. So what was really going on here? And there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. We tend to see in our opponents, and we tend to see in those who we are contesting with, a higher level of perhaps rationality, sensibility, planning, organization than maybe they have. We're far more critical of ourselves, obviously. We sort of think we're much less good at it, but we see Persian cunning where we're looking at. I'd like to suggest to you that actually they're just as incoherent, if not more incoherent, than we are. Yeah, that they have just as much nerves, just as much anxiety, and just as much fear, probably more than we have. When you look at why they took the decision to launch that attack on the 13th of April, I think it was, or the evening, morning of the 14th, it's quite interesting what the reasons were. Everyone assumed it was because of the attack on Damascus. And that attack was very serious, of course. But what did that attack really indicate to them? It indicated to them that their security and intelligence is not particularly good. Because how had the Israelis worked out where these people were going to be at a precise time so they could be hit so precisely at that particular moment, with 7 senior IRGC commanders? And this was not the first time it had happened. So there's a degree of anxiety there. But I think far more damning for them was the idea that they weren't really playing up and playing their role properly in the war on Gaza, that they were doing very good at cheering from the sidelines, it has to be said, and very volubly. But the Houthis and others had sort of said, well, where are you? What are you doing? So there was a credibility gap for them. And they had to fill that credibility gap by saying, we're going to do it. They made it very clear that we're going to do it. We're not going to get our proxies to do it. We're going to do it. So I think that was part of the measure. And I think it was driven very much by elements within the Revolutionary Guard and the younger generation who wanted something to be done, who'd been nurtured on a generation of rhetoric that said that Iran was a great power, like Cyrus the Great, and that we had to do something. Of course, the paradox of Cyrus the Great, by the way, as we know, is slightly, Cyrus the Great's role in history vis-a-vis the Jews is somewhat different to Khamenei's, but the fact that he wanted to draw that parallel was an interesting bit of ideological spin. So that was one part that wanted to do it. But then there was another part of the establishment or the regime who were very anxious about it. And as I was saying earlier, one of the most striking things about it was that the Iranian mission at the UN, while the missiles were en route, declared that as far as we're concerned, that's it, and the matter is concluded. And as a number of my colleagues pointed out, that's pretty quick de-escalation. I mean, they haven't actually seen what's happened yet. They don't even know if the missiles will hit, but they've declared, we've done it now, we're back. So that says to me a regime that is somewhat more nervous and worried about what the consequences of that may be. And it also indicates to me, perhaps, and this may be the solution, that the reason why it seems quite confused, because the motives seem a little bit confused and we don't quite really know what they were doing, bearing in mind that a good deal of their missiles also didn't launch, or many of them fell short. Some of them, I understand, were fired without warheads, which is quite interesting. This performative experience, what was it about? I think perhaps to my mind, one of the best solutions to it is to say that actually they didn't really know as well as, they weren't as clear what they were doing as anyone else. That they were torn between two sort of ambitions, and what they wanted to do by dint of good measure, unless you really believe, which is what some of my analysts and others have commented on, unless you really believe that they had telegraphed their attack to the West ahead of time in great detail and relied on the Israelis, the Americans, the British and the French to shoot them all down before they got there. That's a hell of a trust to have in the great Satan, I've got to say, Mitchell. But some people do believe that. I don't find that credible at all. I mean, I think if you look at some of the ways in which they were presenting the attack on the television as it was happening, and the IRGC, by the way, announced that targets had been hit before the missiles had landed, by the way. So I mean, that's also quite entertaining. But if you look at the way in which it was presented on Iranian television, it was presented as a fairly devastating attack. I mean, it was quite clear. So they were messaging to their own in that respect. They were messaging to some of their proxies and others. But I don't think actually it probably had the effect that they wanted. And I'm very struck by the fact that everything has been put back in its box as quickly as they came out. I mean, basically, the Iranians are not, you know, they're keeping very quiet, and they're withdrawing some of their operatives in Iraq and Syria. So I think, again, what does that tell me? It tells me that you have a political system that is in much worse shape and much more nervous than we would think. This will tell you in one image why I think they're much more nervous than they should be, than they are. This is the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargad, and the tomb of Cyrus has become a major center of pilgrimage, and I use that term deliberately, for many, many Iranians. It's become such a center of pilgrimage for many, many Iranians that the regime has now banned people actually going to. They find it that worrying. In the same way that, as you know, people say when you're looking at what's going on in Iran, the Iranian regime on the night of the attack on Israel said, if anyone is caught criticizing our actions and supporting Israel, they'll be arrested. You'll be interested to see, obviously, the social media content went down very quickly. But why say that if that's not what people were doing? One Iranian sportswoman actually did say it. She went on Instagram and she said, I'm ashamed of what we've done. And needless to say, she was arrested. And there were many others who had protested what was going on. That's partly to do with the fact, as I said, that, or largely to do with the fact, I think, that there's a huge, huge disparity of views between wider society and the regime. And this picture, as I said, for me, explains in one visual, really, why the regime is having a huge, huge difficulty in connecting with its own public. You never would have seen this 10, 20 years ago. But even the assessments that are being made now, I'm not a great fan, I have to say, of polling, and some of the, particularly in authoritarian systems, I think polling actually in our own societies can be a bit wonky at times. But nonetheless, there have been a number of what we call focus groups, or more in-depth sort of assessments on Iranian society that have taken over several years, which have shown that society has moved quite dramatically in an alternative narrative or an alternative path to government, i.e. far more secular, far more nationalistic, far more cosmopolitan, actually, and not interested in any aspects of the Islamic Revolution in that sense. So that again is quite interesting. And this is something, a change that's been occurring really over the last 3 to 4 years. But it has occurred over the back of a series of protests, the last of which we saw in 2021, 22. But these series of protests have become increasingly violent, and they're having this, they're having a damning effect on a popular opinion towards the government. Now, what does that mean in terms of the stability of the state going forward? I don't want to say, and I'm not going to be one of those that's going to tell you that the government is going to collapse, or, you know, the regime is going to collapse and you're going to have a velvet revolution. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that it does indicate to us that the system is much more brittle and much more fragile than people think it is. So if we know where we've come from, where we're going, and these are the things that I think, in terms of understand the evidence. Let me give you another little bit of evidence that I thought was quite striking. The morality police is back on the streets. Okay, and it's back on the streets in a fairly vicious way. Okay, much more vicious than it was beforehand. But the morality police are wearing bulletproof vests. Why are they wearing bulletproof vests? You know, the morality police, Mitchell, if you, obviously we haven't come across them, I mean, it's basically there to tell you to put your headscarf up properly. But why are you wearing bulletproof vests? And I did mention this to someone. I said, what's all this about? And they said, well, that's because last time people were shot. And I said, really? When were they shot? You know, what was going on? And again, it offers you an insight. We don't know. I don't have the hard evidence of saying that morality police people were shot last time round. But if they're wearing bulletproof vests now, they're clearly worried. And again, that doesn't indicate to me a society, or a state, I should say, that feels secure within its own public. Okay, so these are things I think that, you know, drilling down into the evidence, we can sort of try and pick out and understand and see what's going on. I want to end with my favorite film, which I know my wife is going to kill me about. For those of you who have not seen it, you should see it. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which I sort of force my family to watch once a year. They've never forgiven me, but there you are. But I think The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp does, its central narrative is interesting and goes to the point of one of the things that I want to try and get across to us. And that is the notion of moral clarity. And what I'm not talking about is clarity. I think we're in search of clarity about Iran all the time. Finding clarity about political systems, authoritarian political systems that are quite opaque and quite difficult to penetrate and quite difficult to understand, is not something that I think we should be spending an inordinate amount of time over. It's obviously one aspect of the way in which we research and analyze these societies, but we need to take care. And this is why I think, to come back to Churchill, I think it's quite important to understand what Churchill offers. Churchill is an individual who gets up in 1940 and makes it very clear what the situation is. I mean, he said it before 1940, but you know, when he becomes prime minister. And what he's offering here is moral clarity. It's not just simply a question of clarity in terms of saying, what do we know in a factual or empirical sense about a particular state or a particular system? I think these things are very difficult, and they become very frustrating to those of us who are trying to find things out. They become particularly frustrating when the system that we are trying to sort of look at and analyze is very good at putting out, you know, false flags, a lot of chaff that we need to get through. And sometimes this chaff is very interesting. Of course, they set up these bogus think tanks and bogus polling and bogus all sorts of things, and people will tend to assume it. I've seen it done myself, by the way. I've seen it done myself. It happens. But people, they know how to sort of put facts on the ground, if I can put it that way. And what they're trying to do is they're sort of working on this basis that in the West, we're now so dominated, I'm sorry to say, by targets and facts and data, that until we can get sort of clarity in that sense, we're unwilling to do anything. And what I want to say to you is that actually the interesting thing is that it's not clarity that we need to look for, but moral clarity. We need to know the difference between right and wrong, and we need to be more certain in our own sense about, you know, what we're facing. And that moral clarity, I think, would help us, I think, with certainly with Iran, but many of the authoritarian states that we now find ourselves confronting. It's interesting that when you look from the other side in, by the way, they offer a lot of their own moral clarity. It's very clear. It's the great Satan. There's no shakes about that, Mitchell, right? It's a very clear, there's very clear moral clarity for you, and they're offering leadership to those who believe. But we, on the other hand, I think are very, very keen to show a certain amount of essential ambiguity, shall we say. It's a sort of a sophisticated way of looking at things. And in many ways, that's good. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, we have to be able to provide ourselves with a degree of moral clarity. And for me, if you look at Churchill in 1940, what is it about him that irritates a lot of people today, by the way? It's simply this fact that at that moment of the highest trauma and the highest crisis, he offered moral clarity. Now, the whole business of the story of The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, for those of you who haven't seen it, Churchill didn't like the film, of course, because he thought that Colonel Blimp was a sort of a pastiche of him. It wasn't. Colonel Blimp, by the way, is the chap in the middle. It also contained within it, which is very interesting, a German character that was a sympathetic German character. And the German character, who was a friend of the colonel, basically has to educate, explain, shall you say, the Colonel Blimp, what the realities of fighting a war against Nazi Germany is about. This is not a rules-based system. Okay, and how, at the end of the day, in terms of realpolitik, do you, as a liberal country, as a liberal state, contend with states that are illiberal? It's a very difficult question. I mean, I'm not going to say it's easy to answer at all, but it's something that I think that certainly the experience of Churchill and certainly our experience today in dealing with Iran and other countries like them, we need to be a little bit more engaged with, I think is the best way to put it. But what are the limits of that? And I think, you know, the whole question of realpolitik as being one, as I understand it, not, as John Bew says, not Machtpolitik, but realpolitik, is this notion of engaging a sort of a liberal agenda in an illiberal world. How do you pursue that? How do you engage in that illiberal world without, and this is the important point, losing your own sense of identity? because this is the crucial thing. And I want to, because I think this is a bit, now I'm sorry to say that I typed this up and it's a rather long piece of text, but I think it's a really important statement because I think it sums up really for me what Churchill's achievement was at the end of the day. And I think it's something that is worth remembering. And it's a comment made by Ed Morrow, believe it or not, who was obviously here during the war. What I was fascinated about Ed Morrow, I thought, was that when he actually came to Britain, he didn't really have a very high opinion of Britain, actually. He thought it was a bit dull. The weather was terrible. The food was poor. The streets were narrow, as he said. And the men unambitious. In fact, that's what he said. He said unambitious, which I thought was quite striking. Anyway, he came over and he wasn't particularly interested. But in 1946, as he was leaving, he made the following comment. And I know this a bit, so I'm going to read this to you. But I think it's really interesting because it tells us something, I think, also about ourselves today. I've learned that the most important thing that has happened in Britain during the last 6 years, it was not, I think, the demonstration of physical courage. That has been a cheap commodity in this war. I doubt that the most important thing was Dunkirk or the Battle of Britain, El Alamein or Stalingrad. Historians may decide that any of these events were decisive, but I am persuaded that the most important thing that happened in Britain was that this nation chose to win or lose this war under the established rules of parliamentary procedure. It feared Nazism, but it did not choose to imitate it. Representative government, equality before the law, survived. Future generations who bother to read the official record of the proceeding of the House of Commons will discover that British armies retreated from many places, but there was no retreat from the principle for which your ancestors fought. And I think that's an extraordinary thing to say and an extraordinary compliment to make. And I think it's probably one of the most important compliments to make of Churchill's achievement and the general achievement of this country during the war. That what it did is it fought an illiberal system, often in very interesting ways, it has to be said, but it never lost sight of the fact of who they were. And I think that's vital. And I'm reminded that during the struggles of the last year or so in Iran, it was very interesting talking to dissidents in Iran. They complained bitterly, absolutely bitterly, about the way in which the diaspora leadership were carrying on, the way in which sometimes their own aspirations were being thwarted. There was a lot of determination there, I have to say. A lot of determination, a lot of anger, a lot of genuine anxiety to get ahead. But they were frustrated, and you could see they were frustrated. I mean, they were being beaten and bruised and whatever. And one of them said to a colleague of mine, he said, we don't need all this woolly, wet, shoving around, ambivalence. We don't need this. What we need in Iran is a Churchill. And he said that very emphatically. And I think on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave you with that thought, because it reminds us that this giant, I think, of world history has cast a very, very long shadow. And for me, it remains, I think, a fascinating, I think, little vignette that young people in Iran today, far from looking at Churchill as the epitome of the British Empire, are seeing in Churchill the epitome of moral clarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. I think we have some time for a few questions, if you'll be so good as to take some. So please just identify yourself and please try to keep your questions as brief as possible.
Hello. Oh, thanks. Hello, I'm just an ordinary journalist, but not to do with here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just curious because the question that you say about before the law and the established rules of parliamentary procedure, and I think about what's happened in recent times.
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson, who I would say modeled himself.
it would come. Yeah.
How does that fit?
How does that fit? Well, I mean, you won't be, I'm not saying that we're doing it very well. I mean, you know, what I'm saying here is precisely this, that, I mean, if you look at it, and by the way, it applies across the board, be it the United States, Israel, here, whatever, you know, that when you're fighting in a situation, even when you consider it to be an existential threat, you mustn't lose sight of who you are. Now, the important point is that, and I've said this on many times, unless you are confident and certain of your own moral position and going forward, you will never be able to deliver or do the things that you need to do. This is the paradox. And this is the great achievement of the Iranians, by the way, at the moment. If you want to look at it, and I'd say this, hopefully this is not being recorded, but this is what they sow, and the Russians do the same. They sow doubt. Okay, that's what they're doing. They sow doubt. I mean, for goodness, I can tell you this. Iranians, and it's a what, I mean, and let's be honest about it. I don't want to be, I don't want to be definitive about it, because the stuff we get on social media is not something that I can say with great certainty is 100% correct. Okay, but I'm talking about the social media from Iran, by the way. But you don't know who's, you don't know where these people are. But I get a, eventually you get a sort of a general sense of the notion. The idea, and it is an appalling thing, by the way. When you look at it from the perspective of a young Iranian fighting for things that people in this country take for granted. And you have people in this country, I'm sorry to say, learning in the University of Chicago, actually, let me not blame the University of Chicago, how to say death to America. I mean, think about it. And not only, when you watch the video, by the way, they not only say death to America, I think I sent you the video. They don't say death to America, they then go, what does that mean? This is my point about, understanding and dealing with Iran, is we've got to get a better sense of what we're doing and where we're coming from. And, Iranians are apoplectic with rage about this, I have to think. I mean, I'm talking about young Iranians saying, what the hell is going on? What is going on? Why is it that we're not getting any support? Now, I understand that. I don't want to sort of let's not be romantic about it. But it is interesting, what they do is they, that moral clarity, now be it at a political level or a social level, or an academic level, by the way. I don't even want to start, I'm not going to, eulogize my profession, because I have to say quite a few of them have lost the plot. Yeah. But, unless we have some sort of measure of what that's about, we can never really deal with the challenge. And that's what they do. They sow doubt, they sow dissent, they sow this, they say, well, hypocrisy, contradiction, this, that, and the other. Fine. But there has to be a way of dealing with it. And of course, politicians have a particular responsibility, but they're not exclusive. Have a particular responsibility. I would certainly even hold your profession in some criticism on this, I have to say, in being able to sort of set the values and the standards that, really we should come to expect from them. And it stretches across the public service, by the way, but as well as others. So I'm not saying, I don't want to sort of pick on one particular group by any stretch of the imagination, but, you're citing Boris Johnson and others, fine. And that does, it's emblematic. It is emblematic of a problem. And it goes back, I mean, I think one of the interesting things for me, and when I was thinking, because, let me, Samuel Huntington wrote a very interesting book, which has largely been misunderstood, about change in political societies. I can't remember the exact name now.
Clash of Civilizations.
No. Don't go anywhere near that book. No, a much earlier one. It was, normally it's the first book they write is the best thing. It's back in 1964, okay? And he made a very, very interesting point there. He said the problem with American policy towards development in the third world is because the Americans inherited their political ideas and institutions from Britain, they have never really understood the importance of building up good governance. They have always led economic-led development. The economy will do it because they've assumed that things come with them. This is precisely actually the point that these people in 2007 were talking about in William and Mary. They said, that basically those people who fought for the American Revolution, in that sense, fought for their rights as freeborn Englishmen. It was the thing that really shocked me, I have to say. Yeah, I was really stunned by it. But now, the problem we have, and the problem I think in Iran has, is because when you inherit a particular set, you don't know the value of it. Yeah, and I think we're slightly lost in that. But I think one of the problems in Iran is precisely this. They inherited the Pahlavi state. It was a powerful state. It had a large army. It was rich. And they've just basically gone around messing around with it. They've never, see, when the Pahlevis were founded in the 1920s, they had to build the state from scratch. And it took a long time and blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. But the Islamic revolutionaries inherited it, got it for free. And actually, when I say for free, do you know how many people died before the Shah left the country? Do you know how bloody the Islamic Revolution was? Do you know what the official figures? Because most people don't know this, actually. It's very interesting. Most people, oh, it was thousands. No, 2,783 people died. 2,783. Juxtapose that with Syria. Shah left on the 16th of January, 1979. 2,783 people died. I'd be shocked at that. And most of the bloodletting happened afterwards. Yeah. Now, when you win something so cheaply, you don't know the value. Sorry, that was a rather long-winded
Perhaps
answer
one more
and
question.
went all over the place.
Perhaps one more question.
Go on.
In retrospect, as within Iran, everyone is looking back at what happened.
Yeah.
What is your understanding of how it is being thought about and interpreted now?
So what's interesting about that, and it's a good point, is that it actually, there isn't a huge amount really being discussed, certainly publicly, about it. What they have, the way they presented it, of course, is as a great triumph, which has now been sealed, signed, and that's it. They're even talking about, you know, what Netanyahu may or may not do in Rafah as, well, it's just a tactical thing because he just hasn't got much else to do. They're presenting it in a much, much more sort of bombastic, triumphalist way, which is now finished. Okay, and they're not actually looking any further. I would, there's a difference, of course, to be honest, between what's coming out of official channels and what's coming out of what we would call the sort of useful idiot brigade, which populate much of social media, which are very bombastic about it all and following the war in Gaza with great interest and intent. But my sense of it is, and this is the thing that's really struck me about it, is how quiet it's gone. And it has gone extremely quiet. And that, for me, says that they're very anxious. Get back in the bunker. They don't want to be out there. They don't like being out there. They far prefer the Persian way in warfare, so to speak, where, you know, Arabs kill Arabs and, you know, we can sit back and cheer. Yeah. But they don't want to get involved. And I do find that, part of me, I find it quite puzzling, but I don't know how sustainable it is given the level of rhetoric that they put out. I mean, that's for me quite interesting. And I'd be the first to admit that I found the whole business of the last 4 weeks and fighting the attack an enigma. I mean, I really did, because I couldn't, as I was saying to you earlier, almost every Iranian analyst that I talked to, and I'm talking about Iranians who are sort of based in, you know, either wherever part of Europe or whatever, but also a lot of social commentators, all said that the Islamic Republic would not do it because it wasn't their way of doing it and they didn't have the guts. Now, whether they were taunting them to be able to do it is another matter, but that was the way. So a lot of them didn't feel that that was, so the sense that a lot of people have, and I think when we look at it now, is that they did so very, very reluctantly. And there were some elements obviously pushing for it, but now they've closed it down. And I think the other thing which we haven't mentioned, of course, is the Israeli response, which also is interesting because this is, let me just say this actually, because it's very interesting. So the Israeli response, they immediately put anchormen and cameramen in Isfahan to talk about what a glorious sunny day it is and there's absolutely nothing going on, in order to reassure people. They then covered up the damage that had been done, and we know now, obviously, that the quite significant damage had been done, obviously, to the air defences. But I think that signal, interestingly, I think that signal has been read very clearly. Anyway, sorry, I did ramble on a bit too long.
All right.
It was a great question, though. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Ansari.
Thank you. I hope that was, I was trying to combine Churchill with it.